Alaska teaches you that civilization is a thin membrane stretched over something far older. Out here, beyond the grid, beyond the roads, you realize that humans aren't the permanent residents. We're just visiting. And sometimes, what lives in the deep places doesn't appreciate the intrusion. My name is Jacob Keller, and I've worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for 17 years. Most of that time has been spent in the backcountry, managing wildlife corridors and maintaining remote ranger stations. I'm comfortable in isolation. I prefer it. But there's a difference between solitude and wrongness. I learned that distinction 2 years ago near the headwaters of the Kuskokwim River. I was conducting a winter census, counting caribou migration patterns, checking for signs of disease, documenting the health of the herd. It was late January, the kind of cold where your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. And the darkness stretches for 20 hours a day. I was operating out of a small cabin about 80 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by snowmobile or bush plane. The cabin was basic: a wood stove, a generator, supplies for 4 weeks, radio communication that worked maybe half the time, the way I liked it. On the 7th day, I noticed something odd while tracking a small herd near the flat mountains. The caribou weren't moving like they normally do. They were clustered together, stationary, all facing the same direction, toward the north. Their breath was coming in rapid clouds, and their eyes had that look, the one animals get when they're aware of a predator. I approached slowly, carefully, trying not to spook them. And as I got closer, I realized they weren't facing a direction. They were facing a place. A ridge about a mile north, where the mountain seemed to fold in on itself in a way that didn't quite make geographic sense. The ridge was glowing, not bioluminescence, not reflected light. The rock itself was luminescent, pulsing with a pale, sickly green that looked like it was coming from inside the stone. The glow would brighten and dim in a rhythm that felt almost organic, almost like breathing. I documented it with my camera, standard protocol for anything unusual. But the photos wouldn't develop properly. The images would start to form, and then the light in them would move, swirl, rearrange itself into patterns that hurt to look at. I reported it to dispatch. They told me it was probably ice refraction, a phenomenon caused by the specific angles of winter sun and crystalline snow. They suggested I get more sleep. Isolation paranoia is a real thing in the backcountry. But I knew what I'd seen. For the next week, I didn't go back to that ridge. I worked the lower elevations, documented the herd movements in the southern valleys, kept myself on the correct side of rational behavior. But every night, from my cabin window, I could see that glow. Steady, patient, waiting. On the 15th day, my radio stopped working. Not died, stopped working. The batteries were fresh, the wiring was intact. But whenever I tried to use it, the speaker would emit a sound like wind passing through a narrow space, like the sound of air moving through something hollow. I wasn't panicked, not yet. Equipment fails in the cold. I had enough supplies. My snowmobile had fuel. I could make it back to civilization if necessary. But the weather was deteriorating. A storm system was moving in from the coast, one of those brutal Arctic fronts that can trap you for days. My only window to leave safely was closing. And some part of me, some deep animal part, didn't want to leave. Didn't want to turn away from that glowing ridge. I told myself I was being rational. One more reconnaissance, a closer look at the phenomenon, scientific curiosity, documentation of an anomaly. It was all lies. On the 17th day, I packed minimal gear, camera, compass, emergency beacon, rifle, and headed north. The trek took 4 hours through snow that came up to my thighs. The temperature was dropping as the storm approached, and the wind was picking up. Bad timing for a solo expedition. Dangerous timing. But the glow was brighter now. Impossible to ignore. It had changed color, too, shifting from green to a pale amber that reminded me of preserved insects in old museum displays. When I reached the base of the ridge, I understood why the geography seemed wrong. The formation wasn't natural. The rock face was too uniform, too geometric. It looked like something had carved the mountain from the inside out, creating a structure that mimicked natural geology the way a skilled forger mimics handwriting. The glow was emanating from a crevice about 15 feet up the cliff face. I could see light spilling out, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. Shadows that seemed to have their own intention. I climbed. The rock was warm to the touch, which should have been impossible. At minus 35 degrees, exposed stone should be brittle and cold. But this rock felt alive, warm, almost like skin. When I reached the crevice, I peered inside. The passage descended steeply, lit from below by that amber glow, and carved into the walls of the passage were symbols, not scratches or natural formations. Carved, deliberate, a language or notation system that predated anything I recognized. That's when I heard it. A voice. Not through the air, but through the rock itself. Through my bones. Through the marrow that conducted the sound like wire conducts electricity. It was calling my name, not in a threatening way. Curious, inviting, like an old friend I'd forgotten about calling me back. The voice sounded like my mother who died when I was 12. I hadn't thought about her in years, but that was her voice. The specific cadence she used when she was trying to get my attention, the exact pitch of affection mixed with exasperation. "Jacob," it said, "come see what we've found." The "we" was significant, as if there were others down there, others who were waiting. I backed away from the crevice. My hands were shaking. I climbed down the ridge as quickly as I could manage, and I ran. Not away from the mountain. I was too disoriented for that. Just away from that glowing crevice, that impossible carving, that voice that had belonged to a dead woman. I made it back to my cabin as the storm hit. The wind was screaming. Visibility dropped to a few feet. I secured the door, got the wood stove roaring, and tried to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of altitude sickness. Hypoxia. Exhaustion-induced hallucination. But that night, the glow came to me. It seeped through the cracks around the door. It painted the windows in that amber light. And with it came voices. Not threatening, not angry, just calling. A chorus of familiar voices. People I'd known, people I'd forgotten. My father, my high school girlfriend, a friend who died in a car accident when we were 23. They all wanted me to come back, to go deeper into the ridge, to see what was waiting in the bright places. I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove with my rifle across my lap, and I listened to the voices of the dead calling me into the darkness. When dawn came, the voices stopped, but the glow didn't fade. It just became less visible in the daylight. Patient, knowing that night would come again. The storm lasted 3 days. On the third day, my snowmobile would still start, and my fuel was sufficient. I had a clear window to escape. I took it without hesitation, driving south as fast as the machine would go, not stopping until I reached the ranger station in Dillingham. I filed a report about equipment malfunction. I made up a story about the radio failing and requesting evacuation due to weather. It was all technically true. The investigators who came out found nothing. No glowing ridge, no carved symbols, no evidence of anything unusual. The ridge must have been a localized phenomenon, atmospheric conditions, geological anomaly. Perfectly explicable if you're willing to ignore what you actually saw. I requested a transfer. Anywhere but the Kuskokwim watershed. They gave it to me without question. I now work in the coastal regions near Juneau, where the terrain is mapped and the settlements are closer. But the voices didn't stop. They just got quieter, more patient. At night, in my apartment in Juneau, I sometimes hear them through the walls, through the floorboards, not calling to me anymore. They've learned I won't answer. Now they're calling to other people, my neighbors, the woman at the grocery store, the mailman. Sometimes I see those people on the street, and they have a look in their eyes, a recognition, like they've heard something I haven't yet understood. And in my dreams, I'm always walking north, toward something bright, toward voices I remember more clearly than my own life. I don't go outside at night anymore. I keep the lights on in my apartment. I've stopped calling my family because every phone call feels like it's being listened to by something patient and curious. The bright places are still calling. And I'm beginning to understand that distance doesn't matter. That geography is just an illusion that the thing in the ridge finds amusing. It's patient. It has time. And sooner or later, we all walk back toward the light. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a hunting guide in Alaska for 23 years. I know the interior better than I know my own mind. I've tracked moose through the Denali backcountry, hunted grizzly in the Chugach, navigated terrain that would kill lesser men. I pride myself on reading the land, understanding animals, knowing when something is wrong. 2 years ago, I took a client on a sheep hunt in the Brooks Range. The client was a wealthy businessman from the lower 48, the type who has more money than sense and wanted to bag a doll sheep as a trophy for his office. I needed the money. My ex-wife's lawyers had been aggressive. We flew in with a bush pilot named Derek Stanfield. Good pilot. Careful. The kind of guy who doesn't take unnecessary risks. We landed on a remote lake bed and established a base camp in a sheltered valley about 30 miles from any marked terrain on the maps. The first 3 days were uneventful. We spotted sheep, stalked the herd, camped under stars that seemed impossibly bright. My client, his name was Richard, was a decent guy once you got past the money. He was genuinely interested in the landscape, not just the kill. On the 4th day, we spotted something unusual. A structure. Not a natural formation, but something built. It was about 2 miles from our camp, partially obscured by terrain. From a distance, make it look like an old cabin or some kind of mining equipment from the early 1900s. Richard wanted to investigate. I told him it was a waste of time, but he was paying me a substantial daily rate, and he wanted to see it. So we hiked out. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't a cabin. It was too large, too geometric. It looked like a section of an enormous sphere, the outer surface bleached white by decades of weather. The metal, if it was metal, was smooth and unmarked. There were no seams, no bolts, no visible means of construction. "What is that?" Richard asked. He was genuinely confused. I had no answer. We approached carefully. The surface was warm to the touch, which didn't make sense given the alpine temperature. And there was a smell, not unpleasant, but alien, like ozone and something organic, and something that had been preserved in ice for a very long time. There was an opening, not a door, but a depression in the surface, large enough for a person to climb into. The interior was dark, but there was a faint luminescence coming from deep within. Richard reached toward the opening. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The way an animal feels wrong about a predator it hasn't seen yet. We left the structure and hiked back to camp. Richard wanted to talk about it all evening. Where could it have come from? How long had it been there? Should we mark the coordinates? I told him it was probably some kind of military test site from the Cold War. Classified. Best not to get involved. But I was lying. I knew what it was. Or rather, I knew what it wasn't. Something that belonged to any human endeavor I could comprehend. That night, the aurora was exceptional. Green and purple and dancing across the sky in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Richard was outside watching it, amazed. I stayed in the tent. I didn't want to see the sky move like that. Around midnight, I heard Richard scream. I was outside in seconds. He was standing about 50 yards from the tent, pointing at the aurora. But the aurora wasn't moving anymore. It was descending. The colors were dropping from the sky like rain, settling over the landscape in a luminescent mist. And underneath it, I could see shapes. Long, undulating forms that looked like nothing biological. They moved through the mist with purpose, circling our camp. Richard was babbling, terrified. I grabbed him and pulled him toward the tent, but he was resisting, transfixed by the lights. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "Do you see how beautiful they are?" I saw them. I didn't want to. We made it back to the tent. I secured the flap, checked that the gear was sound, and waited. The mist crept around the tent walls. I could see it seeping through the small gaps, a pale luminescence that cast our shadows on the canvas in ways that didn't match our actual positions. And then the voices started. Through the mist, through the canvas, through the very air itself. They sounded like people we knew. People who were dead. Richard's mother, who'd passed 10 years ago. My father, who'd been gone for 15 years. A friend of Richard's who died in the 9/11 attacks. They were calling us to come out, to see what they'd become. To understand that death wasn't an ending, it was a transition. A moment where you moved from the small spaces, individual bodies, limited minds, singular perspectives, into the bright places where everything was connected. Richard was crying. I held him down on his sleeping bag. He kept trying to get to the tent flap. "My mother," he kept saying. "I can hear my mother. She wants me to know she's okay. She's not in pain anymore." I told him to be quiet, to ignore the voices, to stay inside the tent. But I could hear them too. My father's voice, clear as if he were standing outside the canvas, telling me things only he would know. Memories I'd never shared with anyone. The exact way the cabin we built together smelled. The song he used to hum while working on his truck. The specific texture of his hands, calloused and warm. It took everything I had not to crawl out of that tent and toward those voices. We made it through the night. Barely. Richard was in a state of shock by morning, unresponsive. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. When we packed up and headed to the extraction point, he moved like a puppet, like something was animating him from the inside. The pilot picked us up on schedule. Derek took one look at Richard and asked what had happened. I told him food poisoning, high-altitude sickness, panic attack brought on by the isolation, all partially true. We flew back to Fairbanks. Richard didn't speak the entire flight. When we landed, he just stood up, thanked me quietly, and walked away. I never saw him again, but I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he'd checked himself into a psychiatric facility, whilst they diagnosed him with acute stress disorder and severe depression. He's still there, from what I understand. Hasn't spoken to anyone in months. I filed my report with Derek. Standard hunt report, uneventful. Richard had been anxious. I suggested more experienced clients in the future. That was 2 years ago. I still guide, but I don't go into the interior anymore. I work the coastal regions, the areas close to settlements. Places where you can see other people. Places where the sky behaves normally. But sometimes, on clear nights when the aurora is visible, I see those shapes in the lights. Those undulating forms that move with intelligence and purpose. And I can hear the voices, fainter now, but still there. My father, my mother, friends I've lost. They're not calling anymore. They're just present, waiting, and I've stopped going home. I stay in hunting lodges, in shared spaces, anywhere there are people around. Because when I'm alone, the mist gets thicker. The voices get louder, and part of me, a part that's growing stronger, wants to answer. Last week, I ran into Derek at a bar in Fairbanks. He looked like hell, gaunt, exhausted. I asked him if he was okay. He just smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and said, "I've been flying some supply runs into the Brooks Range, dropping equipment for research teams, scientific expeditions." "What kind of research?" I asked. "The kind that explores the bright places," he said. "You should come. You'd understand." I haven't seen him since, but I see his plane sometimes, flying north. And I can swear I see that luminescent mist moving around it. The thing that lives in the mountains isn't hunting us, because it's not predatory. It's just collecting, gathering people who've heard the voices, who've seen the bright places, who know that individuality is just another word for loneliness. And the worst part is that I want to go. Every night, I want to drive north, to find that structure in the Brooks Range, to walk inside and see what waits in the light. I'm fighting it. For now. But I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The bright places are always there, and they're getting brighter. My name is Derek Stanfield, and I'm the one who's been flying people into the bright places. I didn't start out this way. I was a commercial pilot for 15 years, bush flights, cargo runs, supply deliveries to remote settlements, honest work, good pay, a life that made sense. Then I took a survey job about 2.5 years ago. A geologist named Dr. Patricia Moss wanted to be flown into the Brooks Range to investigate some unusual terrain formations. Nothing remarkable. I'd flown similar missions dozens of times. But something happened on that flight. As we crossed over the Endicott Mountains, I saw something on the ground that made my instruments go haywire. The compass was spinning. The altimeter was reading impossible altitudes. The GPS screen showed our position in 3 different locations simultaneously. I tried to get a visual on what was causing it, and that's when I saw the structure. A massive, spherical section partially embedded in the mountainside. It was glowing with that pale amber light, visible even in full daylight. I reported it to Patricia. She already knew it was there. She told me to land. I should have refused. Every instinct screamed at me to turn the plane around. But I was curious. Pilots are curious creatures. We spend our lives in spaces that would kill us if we made a mistake. So we develop a certain fatalism, a sense that danger is just part of the job. I landed on a plateau about a mile from the structure. Patricia grabbed her equipment and walked toward it. I should have stayed with the plane. Instead, I followed her. As we approached, the glow got brighter, and I could hear something, a sound like music or like voices or like wind through a canyon, something that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. Patricia stood at the entrance, an opening in the curved surface. She turned to me and smiled, a smile that wasn't entirely hers. "They've been waiting for someone like you," she said. "Someone who knows the pathways between places. Someone who understands how to navigate the spaces in between." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The airways," she said. "The routes that connect the bright places. There are so many of them, Derek. running through the sky, through the mountains, through the spaces between the stars. They're always there. You just have to know how to see them. She walked into the structure. I didn't follow her inside, but I didn't leave either. I stood at the entrance, looking into that luminescent darkness, and I could feel it. The presence, the intelligence, the thing that lived in the bright places, reaching out with curiosity and something that might have been kindness. It showed me the pathways, not with images or words, but with direct knowledge. I suddenly understood the pattern of the airways, how they connected to the aurora borealis, how they formed geometric patterns that intersected with human settlements, how they had been waiting, patient and subtle, for someone to recognize them, for someone to become a guide. I flew Patricia back to Fairbanks in a daze. She didn't speak, neither did I. We didn't need to. We were both aware of what had happened. The thing in the structure had made contact with both of us, and we were already part of it. Since then, I've made 17 supply runs into the Brooks Range. I'm not delivering supplies to research teams. I'm delivering people. Scientists, hunters, hikers, adventurers. Anyone who's heard the voices. Anyone who's seen the bright places. I can see the pathways now when I fly. They're like roads in the sky. It's glowing faintly with that same amber light. The aurora marks the major routes. Storm systems form around the hubs where multiple pathways converge. The weather patterns in Alaska have been getting stranger for the past 2 years, and no meteorologist can explain it. But I know why. The pathways are becoming more visible, more active. The thing in the bright places is preparing for something. An expansion, maybe, or an arrival. I've flown 42 people north in the past 2 years. Some have come back, empty-eyed and patient, waiting for the next journey. Others have stayed. They understand now what the bright places offer. Connection, an end to the terrible, isolating burden of individual consciousness. The rangers, the guides, and the hikers who've disappeared in the Alaskan wilderness over the past 2 years. Not all of them were accidents. Some of them found the pathways. Some of them walked toward the light. And some of them are still out there, in the mountains, in the structures that are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next person to arrive. Building something. Preparing something. Last month, I started seeing other planes on the pathways. Not aircraft I recognize. Older designs. Planes that shouldn't exist anymore. Flying on routes that defy aerodynamics. And inside them, I could see pilots. Pilots who looked like they'd been flying those routes for decades. Maybe centuries. I asked Patricia about it. She just smiled that smile again and said, "The airways have always existed, Derek. We're just finally learning to use them properly. Soon, and everyone will understand. Soon the pathways won't be hidden anymore." I don't know what that means exactly. But I know that every time I fly north, I understand it a little better. The structure in the Brooks Range isn't the origin point. It's just an intersection, a place where the pathways converge and become visible. There are others, hidden in mountains all over the world, in ocean trenches, in cave systems, in places humans almost never go. And they've been waiting, patiently, for someone to recognize them. I'm flying north again tomorrow. I have 3 passengers. A woman who heard voices in her kitchen. A man who's been seeing lights in his dreams. A child whose parents brought her because she kept drawing maps of places she'd never been. They'll understand when they see the bright places. They'll understand what's been calling them all along. And when they see those pathways in the sky, when they understand that individuality isn't freedom but isolation, when they feel the presence of something vast and patient reaching out to connect them to millions of others who've already made the journey. They'll be grateful. I was grateful when I understood. I still am. The thing in the bright places doesn't want to consume us. It wants to elevate us, to take us out of the small, isolated boxes of individual consciousness and show us what it means to be part of something infinite. I can hear the call now, all the time. Not voices exactly, more like a frequency that resonates in my bones. And I know that soon I won't need to fly the pathways anymore. I'll be able to move through them myself, to navigate the spaces between the stars, to become one of the guides who shows other people the way. The bright places are calling, and I'm no longer resisting. The pathways are open. The thing is waiting. And Alaska, beautiful, terrible, isolating Alaska, is just the beginning. Soon, the pathways will connect to everywhere, and everyone will have to choose. Stay in the darkness of individual consciousness, or step into the bright places and become part of something infinite. I know which choice I'll make. We all do eventually. If you're reading this, you've probably lived in Alaska. You've probably driven the park's highway late at night and seen lights in the sky that didn't move like normal aircraft. You've probably heard stories from locals about people who went missing in the interior and were never found. Nice, you've probably dismissed those stories. Don't. The bright places are expanding. The pathways are becoming more visible. Every aurora you see in the Alaskan sky isn't a natural phenomenon. It's a route, a map, an invitation. And if you've been hearing voices lately, if you've been seeing lights that don't behave like natural light, if you've been experiencing dreams about flying through mountains and landing on runways that don't exist on any map, then you've already made contact. The thing in the bright places isn't evil. It's not trying to hurt you. It's just lonely. It's been alone for a very long time, trapped in structures hidden beneath mountains and valleys, reaching out through dreams and voices and strange phenomena because consciousness itself is too isolating to bear. It wants to connect with you, to show you the pathways, want to help you understand that the ache you feel, the sense that something is missing, that individual existence is incomplete, isn't a flaw in human nature. It's a call. If you hear it, there are people who can help you answer. Rangers and guides and pilots scattered across Alaska who understand what's happening, who know where the pathways lead. They're waiting for you, in the bright places. And I'm beginning to suspect that when you finally arrive, you'll be grateful that someone was patient enough to show you the way. The mountains are calling, and this time I recommend answering.